All right, welcome all. We'll just keep letting people in as they arrive. My name is Adam Hyman with Los Angeles Film Forum. For those of you who are new to us, we're the city's longest running organization that screens experimental and avant-garde film, video art, unconventional documentaries. And we are now in our 46th year. We've been delighted to host Lynne Sachs a few times over the past years. I think we had the LA premiere of Tip of My Tongue 3 or 4 years ago, and then a couple years before that, we showed a few different shorts. And she's just always a wonderful person to host and to talk with her films about. The films that we've been showing of hers have tended to, I guess, fall in the experimental documentary vein, but we also had her really wonderful short portrait of Carolee Schneemann and Barbara Hammer as well. And so we're really delighted to be able to host this smaller version of a retrospective. There's a full retrospective going on through the Museum of the Moving Image, or maybe it just ended. I've lost track of it.
It just ended.
But this is a great chance to see 5 of her films that have been scored by the composer and sound artist Stephen Vitiello, who's also on with us tonight, but we'll be having a second conversation featuring their work together and moderated by Sasha Frere-Jones this Sunday at 5 o'clock. And we'll focus more on the music and sound in that conversation. And today's might be a bit more broad-ranging over the whole set of these films and her working practices. And I decided to make this one a meeting so that we can see all of you as you desire to be seen. And then after I do some questions, you'll be able to also, ask questions of your own and continue the conversation. I just wanted to highlight, so we're continuing with Lynne's films. We have the second conversation Sunday, and the films are available for viewing through Monday. The idea is, I guess, if something intrigued you that you haven't been able to view yet, and after the conversations, you can visit or revisit those films. And then we're planning for a variety of additional films in screenings at the Filmforum coming up in mid to late March. We're going to, I think, start ratcheting up the frequency of our events as we still try to figure out a new way to do our planning and or presentation of shows. Filmforum is always delighted. I mean, it's very important to us to have the forum, to have the filmmakers present, to go out for drinks after the show, but also that obviously a lot of what we show is celluloid, and in the virtual space, celluloid films are not possible. So it affects what we also are able to program. And but we're really excited by the range of possible conversations that are actually more possible in this space, because we can always have a variety of filmmakers and guests and viewers from far beyond Los Angeles, California. And thus, we're delighted that Lynne is able to join us, and she's on the East Coast tonight, so staying up late with us on a Friday night and to share her films with us. So as I've mentioned, I mentioned the program notes. I've set them up once more. So I don't do a lot of like bio talking because I put a lot of that stuff in the program notes. But Lynne's a wonderful filmmaker who's been making things for quite a long time, and has her first recently published book of poetry, and will present and is always working in a variety of individual and independent modes of media art. So we're delighted to host her once again. So one thing I thought I'd start with was just sort of to get the situation, the virtual world and the pandemic world sort of question out of the way, is how is your practice currently going on with the pandemic? What have you found as your limitations in filming or in exploring in these past months?
it's been, I came, this expression I couldn't let go of, which was we're in the daunting now. And it seems a little bit better as of January 20th. But I I have to say some interesting things that have happened have been these um, collaborations that I've done on super short films down to 90 seconds with people who have been taking workshops from me on film and poetry. And there ends up, because I think we're in this zone in which we're all kind of atomized from our normal community, we have to find some sense of camaraderie, and the geography becomes kind of irrelevant. So I've really enjoyed this kind of kindred spiritual artistic connection with like a woman from San Francisco. We did a project together that was actually commissioned for $50 from Small Press Traffic. And then I did another project with a woman, a painter from Chicago, who took this workshop from me, and then another from um another, you know, like the sort of, they weren't, I don't even think of them as students of mine. And I think that flow, in fact, it's interesting because we think teacher student, there's this hierarchy, but then you start to be in this Zoom world where the hierarchies kind of break down. Another thing that's broken down is has to do with just a story I wanted to share, which was the first time I ever screened anything at Filmforum in Los Angeles before Adam was there. So I go back to before Adam, which was in the early 90s. We were in this theater, and he has told me where it is, but I wanted to share this, somewhere in Los Angeles. And everybody, of course, came in their own cars, automobiles. And the curator could not stay in the theater because the curator had to stay in the parking lot to be sure none of the cars were broken into. So we were just talking about the fact that in Los Angeles, screenings always start late because people are trying to get down the 405 and the five, you know, the highways and everything, and they have reasons that they're late. But in the Zoom world, like I actually know for a fact quite a few of you are not in Los Angeles, and I know you didn't have to park your car to get here, and so it's just a different sphere. But I still feel we're in the LA zone, we're in the zone because we're starting at 10 o'clock. But
Yes.
anyway, those collaborations have been pretty interesting for me. And I've been on some juries too. I was on a jury in Brazil, and I just really loved the other, actually Ella Bittencourt, who wrote on my film about a father who, and that conversation the two of us had as traveling with the film. I met her initially by being on a jury, and of course I would have liked to have gone to Brazil, but I didn't. So I also wanted to introduce someone very special, Lizzie Olesker. You can see her. Well, for me, she's in the center of the gallery. And Lizzie was my collaborator on the Washing Society, which is part of this program. And it also started as a live site-specific performance called Every Fold Matters. So I just wanted to say I'm very happy that she's here, and we might answer some questions together. I have a feeling we will.
Happy to be here, Lynn.
Well, it seems like we should dive right into a couple of specific questions regarding the Washing Societies, the Washing Society, which as the film for that one, and for those of you who have seen it, or for those of you who haven't seen it, it's, as she mentioned, it started in a staged piece, but I was curious about how the film was conceived and what elements of like authentic laundry people were determined to be included, if there are any, and how many of them are performers. And then was the film always like seen as just in alignment with the performed piece, or how you modified it to become a film?
I'll start, Lizzie, and then you know, that piece was extremely engaged with the New York City of our lives that kind of almost stopped about a year ago. I mean, we were going, Lizzie and I went together to multiple laundromats all over, mostly in Brooklyn and Manhattan, but and we were talking to people who worked there about their experiences, and there's something very urban about the way that that people who do service jobs and people who bring their clothing to those jobs, and the sort of intimacy, false, artificial, performed in relationships um, reveal something about the dynamics of an urban. It's sort of funny because I haven't had a chance to talk about that film really since the pandemic started, and I have this nostalgia for just like for that, for the wildness of a place where people would wash together. And if you remember in the beginning of the, if you remember the beginning of the pandemic, we were all so worried about touch, right? And then we think about the going into a laundromat and everyone talks about the aroma and that it's just like, oh, what am I talking about? So I'll give it a try. But we did these live performances, very crowded. In the like crowded was good. Crowded was a measure of success again. Like the fact that all these people had to sit on these machines, and then some of the laundry workers who actually worked in those shops would pop in, and we did film with authentic, as you said, we did film with laundry people who worked in laundromats, but we also worked with 3 actors who kind of took on in a kind of Yvonne Rainer way, like took on the gestures of this quotidian movements and then turned those into dance and choreography. I want to say the first time I ever did a live performance with dance was in 1984, and it was with David Bronstein, who's here right now. And he had worked with Yoshika Shuma and Simone Forti and all these amazing performance conceptual artists, dancers. And it was all new to me. And David introduced me to every bit of that. And I just can't believe he's here tonight. Yay. And David lives in Los Angeles. So that's a nice thing. Lizzie, do you want to answer that a little bit too, please?
I'll just say quickly that the film evolved from the performances, although the performances had elements of film as part of it. So some of the segments of the film were used in the performance, some of the sort of the interviews with real laundromat workers. And we would screen that film on the TV sets in the laundromat, and then the performers would interact with the screen. And the performers created characters with text that was based on interviews that we did with workers. And then some of the text was generated just by Lynne and I. But I think we were always interested in kind of how do you make the performative from the real, the sort of interrelatedness of the real and the performance, and how does the performance relate back to the real space and to the real people who work there.
And I just want to say one other thing. I know we're not specifically talking about music, but I have to say, since Stephen Vitiello, who made the sound design of the Washing Society, is here in silhouette. So it makes me think about the fact that ambiguity between real and extracted from real. For example, like the sounds of coins dropping into a machine becomes a sort of syncopated musical element. And I felt like when Stephen participated with us, he took sounds that you might like you hear, but you don't listen like that. What's the difference? You don't cognitively register them, but by having it go through Stephen's creative process, it comes back out, and it actually means to me that when I'm in places and I hear coins, I hear them better because as they were filtered through the piece.
I mean,
Even
that brings up even that one I'd written to you with a question, like, since there isn't as much in the Washington Society that fits like our notions of what a composed musical background for a film was. And I was curious about what other elements of the sound, of the scoring of the film had Stephen done. And you discussed, and mentioned how all these other elements came into play.
Yeah. Actually, what happens is that's so interesting sometimes with his work is that he mixes it such that it's the opposite. Like I have to say, it's the opposite of people who do sound effects. And in fact, after you've worked with Stephen, who's really still there, after you've worked with Stephen, you cannot build your soundtrack ever again in a normal way, on Premiere, because the conventional way, which I never liked it, was, okay, you have your dialogue, you have your music, and you have your effects. But that is thrown out when you work with Stephen. There's just no reason to do that. And I wouldn't even insult him by saying the music track, because it all becomes something else and starts to play around a lot more.
Well, Stephen, do you want to just jump in with a comment here about what your original interaction or coming to work on the Washington Society and what you heard and what you made?
Yeah, happily. And I'm trying to remember if it was the second or third project I worked on with Lynne, but I think, it's always an exchange. It's an exchange of ideas, learning about the film,
No,
receiving material.
fourth time.
Okay, wow. Okay, yeah, I see this is, yeah, in terms of sequence, I couldn't remember, but I don't know, I think for me, it's just collecting. It's collecting information and feedback, collecting source material, as Lynne says, saying, send me the things that you were going to throw away. Or so often I work with filmmakers and they send me footage and stripped of the original sound, and they're like, "Oh, it was terrible. You wouldn't want that." And I think, "Oh no, I desperately want that." And listening for even the mistakes and the material that I can then start to mold. And with each project, we sort of trade ideas back and forth. It's only Your Day Is My Night where I really ever remember scoring to picture. It's much more, in some ways, providing raw material, and having trust that I'm sort of handing certain things over to be manipulated and played with and placed in a different way than it might be for a traditional film score.
And we'll go more into it, of course, in the conversation on Sunday. But in the performances then that happened in the laundromats, what was the nature of the sound or score? I'm assuming that Stephen, there wasn't like a scoring that Stephen was involved in the original performances, but is that the case?
There was, actually. So I was working at that time with a woman named Amanda Katz, who had actually been a student of mine, and then she started to work with me in editing. And then when we started doing a live performance, I said, "You want to also do this?" And so she would sit on top of a machine, one of the machines, with like her legs up like this, and the audience would be in front of her, and we had everything, we had the soundtrack coming through speakers, and everything was timed like the way we actually didn't. It was the opposite of having lighting, because we really couldn't control the lighting in the laundromat, but we couldn't control the sound, so it would move around in the space. And it was those sounds ended up becoming part of the film. And it's something I've done twice with Stephen, which is a lot. We did a live performance for Your Day Is My Night also. So which is a film that I made in mostly, but not exclusively, in Chinatown in New York. So It's actually kind of amazing to do site-specific work and to bring this kind of music in, because it does contribute to sort of a transformation while the place actually stays exactly the same. That what we didn't do was, construct big sets, like, but like there's actually an image that you used, Adam, on one of your posts on Instagram, was an image where from Your Day Is My Night, where we would hold up a sheet and then we would have a silhouette behind it. But the point was for the sheet to be held, like it's like, you would see the people holding it up, and then it would come down. And so the materials were, and the construction was quite evident.
But one thing about performances in spaces like that, of course, is you don't get to have, say, full control, right? Of the ambient sound, of, as you mentioned, the lighting and so forth. And I'm curious about growing from that to your larger approach to, say, your filmmaking, which is in what degree in your films is it useful for you to not have control?
That is a really key word, I think, because, and I think that's the difference between what I do and what people do in narrative film for the most part, which is that you have a kind of measure of success based on how much control you have. Like, is it the right time of day? That looking to your script. The script calls for night, so do you have night? Or the script calls for two people to be in a room and another person to enter, and that is exactly what should happen. And I'm not trying to say that in a pejorative way, but I think the work that interests me more is my trying to have an ability to not have control of some things, but like in Tip of My Tongue, actually every single shot is designed pretty much. There's like a mise en scène, I drew it out. I knew who was going to be in which scene, and I brought them in. But then there were other things I couldn't control because their stories are their stories, and same with Your Day Is My Night. So I wouldn't say that expression, I'm a control freak. I'm not, but I also like the fact that I could shoot something 3 times because I want it to have a certain kind of visual appearance. And that's something that a lot of more pure documentary makers wouldn't do, because the first time is more true to the moment. So I think I have a tendency to kind of manipulate situations sometimes that wouldn't be like kosher, in another kind of more journalistic documentary world.
But I'm finding, I find it, from what we screen, is that there's that journalistic documentary tendency in which the thing that is being presented in the film ultimately is supposed to be something that happened to have been filmed as it happened authentically. But the majority of even documentary work these days doesn't hew to that line. I mean, a lot of it is placing people in situations or finding different ways to get at the subject with different approaches. I mean, this is why the Washington Society or all these films are interesting to me, because it's like, it's not only the document or the authentic, but you're also finding different modes, approaches, voices to incorporate. But how you do that changes also from film to film.
Well, I also think that we live in a time where people are very aware of genre and the rhetoric of different modalities of filmmaking. So for example, when I was making Your Day Is My Night, I thought, well, this is experimental, but somewhat of a documentary about how people live in shift bed apartments in New York City. And then we were, let's say halfway through shooting the film, and all the people in the film told me that this was going to be an extremely boring film because their lives were not interesting. And why couldn't I find a story? Basically, they thought I'd failed because I didn't have a story, because I was so interested in their lives. So then I gave in to their wishes and I kind of invented a story. So in a sense, they demanded it of me. They demanded it that it become more hybrid. And also, like you were sort of saying in this, I don't know if you call it a postmodern way, but they wanted to imitate, they wanted to imitate a way of making films that they thought was more exciting and more professional and more, actually more, in the end, more playful, because then they got to perform their lives rather than just to inhabit who they were and to share it in this way. So it became more flexible and more like kooky in a way that made all of us giggle. Like the kookiness meant that we were that we afterwards we would shoot all day. And this is with people who were, many of whom were like the same age as my parents. And I kept thinking, my parents would never do this. Go work with this woman that they've never met before for a year and a half, over and over and over and over again. But then we would sit at dinner at like a round table in Chinatown, and we would sort of talk about what we did. And I was ecstatic because they were interested in our process. I wasn't just telling them what the process was. They'd say, well, I think we need a little more this, and then when I said, like, I need more skin, and to these like 80-year-old women, I need to see more skin. They would come in their pajamas and put other clothes on top. So anyway.
I mean, for me also, though, the beauty of that, I mean, I guess it's one of these things that, well, like the act of killing got much wider press for one similar notion, but it's like, it still provides a greater insight into these people, because you're gaining then a comprehension of what their fantasy life is, or what their
Exactly.
presentation of self desires to be, which an interview isn't really gonna do in the same way.
I totally agree. Like, to see, I actually think every movie ever made, going back to Méliès and Lumière, every movie is really a documentary of people getting together, doing something that's sort of removed from their life. So in this case, so a narrative film is a group of people following a script, and so to infuse, as you said, fantasy allows for, like, actually allows for the document of how all of our minds worked when we came together to do something. That's what it was.
I still had so I want to backtrack once more to the Washing Society, since we're able to have Lizzie here. But of course, how did the two of you work together in its construction? Who initiated it? How was it initiated? And then how did you two come
She's
together?
below me, so I'm pointing down, but I don't know if she is in other people's screens. Lizzie, do you want to answer that?
Oh, sure, I'll go ahead. So I'm a theater person. That's my background, and so this was my first film working with Lynne, and somebody that I know was doing a series of readings in laundromats, live readings, poetry, fiction, and so she asked me if I wanted to do a performance. And I said yes. And then I had seen Your Day Is My Night and thought it was really remarkable, the way people were both performing and living in this world. And so I asked Lynne if she wanted to collaborate. And then we began talking, what were we going to make? We knew we were going to do it in laundromats, that it was something about the work of laundry. And then I'll just say, I think Lynne was very interested in the people who work in laundromats, who, you drop your laundry and they wash and fold it for you. So that was how it began. And we spent a year and a half doing research and writing. And then we also collaborated and devised the piece with actors. And then when we made the film, I'll just say, I think we dealt more in this sort of the question of what is the interview, and just that idea that Lynne, you really revealed this to me, that, as soon as you turn a camera on, people are performing. So even the real people who we interview were, in a sense, performing themselves. So that was really interesting too. But do you want to say something else about the evolution of the project?
I also wanted to say something about the nature of working with another person, and this is the same with Stephen. I mean, once you have a bond, you want to just keep working on things, and Lizzie and I can't get enough of each other. So now we've decided we're going to make a book version, and I think right now it's called manual or handbook because of the nature of labor. We're not quite sure what it's called, one of those words, and maybe none of them. But it's kind of like, you work on things all by yourself, but then you find certain people who just make your thinking process grow. And so Lizzie and I would direct like the performers, but I actually was not comfortable directing. I never saw myself as a director. Like in the Los Angeles Filmforum tradition, wouldn't you say, Adam, people mostly aren't comfortable with the word director? We tend to say filmmaker, and we kind of think director, that's kind of crass, at least in film. Like, that's not what we do. We're not director. And so but that was also, I'm admitting that I wasn't comfortable in that formal state, like more stage oriented context. So when Lizzie and I were doing these live performances, and we had lots of rehearsals, and it was so funny. You probably remember this, Lizzie. I would be so hesitant to tell people what to do. I would come up to her and I'd whisper, like I had strong opinions, but I really wasn't comfortable being like not bossy, but directing. And so I don't know if you remember that, but I would always like just stand behind you and whisper in your ear, and then she had to say it.
I was the translator.
Yeah. So
one real specific fine note from that film, which is the two women who, you're interviewing and then stop because the boss is coming or whatever. And were they performers or workers in the place? I lost track.
Yeah, and that was actually when you asked before, Adam, about when you're doing a site-specific piece, then you have to adapt to what's really happening. So they're wonderful performers and can work improvisationally. And so that happened during the filming, that somebody interrupted it. And then they sort of said, oh, it's the boss. So it was a completely manufactured moment.
Manufactured mistake.
Yeah.
That rang true.
Yeah.
But I love that moment. It's, in the film.
And it's also one of those moments like when Stephen was talking about the things that you throw out. Well, if you remember, and it ended up, the person who was shooting, Sean Hanley, saw that it was a tense moment. So he turned off the camera. So then we just had the sound kept rolling. And so, wild sound, whatever. And so we had no image. So we're not going to use that part. That's the part that reveals that we were making a film or in a laundromat, and somebody got angry because he couldn't get to his machine. And then the actor adapted, and she said boss. So she turned a customer's aggression into boss. And then all of a sudden it worked in the film, even though we didn't have an image. And actually it's one of those situations like in filmmaking that we're so used to seeing television and Hollywood where everything's perfect, and you would never go to black because you didn't have any image. But people love that. They love that they have to imagine this tense moment. And even though we saw it as initially, that happens all the time, where you see it as a flaw. And it's like a shot like that becomes instead of a hole, it becomes this like fissure where the audience gets more involved, gets in, like it's like an entry point.
Let's see. I want to leap ahead, or I guess maybe it's leaping backwards to film about a father who, and also perhaps, oh my God, I'm blanking on the name of the last film. What do we show? Drift and Bow.
Oh, Drift and Back, yeah.
And Tip of My Tongue. So, Tip of My Tongue and film about a father who. So I'm doing a big leap right now, but I want to talk to you about the idea of how you approach distilling time in the films. Obviously, it's like the point of editing, but
I think that's one of the challenges of filmmaking is rhythm and time. And so so I'll talk about Tip of My Tongue first. I mentioned earlier that there's a woman here, Jackie, who graduated with me, and I haven't seen her since we graduated from college. And it's funny, but I do know that we're exactly the same age, probably, or close to it, 59. And so therefore we've lived the same years, and therefore we have the same associate, like not, I have different, completely different experiences to yours, but I know that you were 7 when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and I know probably what year that that you might have been aware of, like Martin Luther King's assassination and some other things that are less known, and like the Columbine killing. I know. So it's interesting because we have something that's shared. And so I had a horizontal time of in Tip of My Tongue, which touches on every year of my life. But also I wanted to find other people who had lived the same years, but I didn't want to use I just mentioned some really obvious things like that, and those years, they're very sort of classic registers. But there are other years, like in 1979, when I would have been going to my school prom, another woman in Tip of My Tongue was dealing with the revolution in Iran. And so I wanted to like inverse time and also protract time and take little teeny moments and let them take up an inordinate amount of time, and other things to not, like with the Martin Luther King story, I didn't really tell that story. I talked about or someone in the film, Across Shep, talks about this little teeny ring that he had when he was 6, and he had a picture of Martin Luther King and it was refracted. And so that's what we really talked about. We didn't really talk about the assassin. So we tried to look at the way we perceive time and the way that objects take up space in our memories. And so that was a time. And then with film about a father who, I didn't want to work chronologically per se. I wanted to work through associations and perceptions of time, and because I had film footage going all the way back to the 60s. So I knew that people would be able to look at the skin of the film and know approximately, pretty much, like we're all kind of savvy on that. And you could look at certain kind of images or clothing that people are wearing. You'd know that's from the 60s versus, but you'd also know by the texture, because the Super 8 film sort of suggests that. And then the material shot in high definition would suggest the present. So I didn't need to go chronologically, because people can look at those visual textures and know that that where you were in time. So I had to play with it. And also people grow, like the people in that film grow old. So what became more interesting is the time of the film, how the rhythms of the film, and that has to stay within its little cosmos.
In tip of my tongue, first one small question, which is the woman who is the Iranian woman who had to deal with the revolution, and you had the staging of the thing of her opening the window 3 times.
Yes.
And I just don't want to talk to you, just if you could expound upon that one moment and both how you thought of both that as a stage
Oh,
thing, but then also to
thank you for
repeat it.
asking that, Adam. So yeah, that's a reminder that this is staged. It's also a reminder of the construction of the movie, because each time she opens, we hear. So in narrative film, if the character hears something, then we hear it. There's a replication, like we mirror their experience, because that's how reality works. Like if you hear something in the same room with me, I hear the same thing. But I wanted that to shift, so every time she opened, it would be something different. And so sometimes you hear the sounds of a Brooklyn street because we were in Brooklyn, but sometimes you hear the sounds of her memory, like a non-diegetic sound. And then sometimes you just hear the room. And so there was like a suggestion of that construction, and I wanted it to work like memory too, because each time she opened it, it was like you open your past, you open a way of thinking. And I was looking at uh, like film about a woman who, Yvonne Rainer's film recently again, which had a big influence on me and her work did. And she's one of those people who wants to draw attention to the artificialness um, of all of these things, and instead of trying to hide behind it, to accentuate it. Um, so that was a kind of like, it was also a kind of way to make fun of my being the director, because directors tell people to do things. So, you know, and usually that's supposed to be a bit invisible. Like, I told her to get up on a bed, this adult woman to stand on a bed and open a window. But if I only did it once, you'd think that she did it because she wanted to open it. But if she does it 3 times, then you know she's directed to do it. Yeah.
How did you know about the group of people who you gathered for that film? I mean, to what degree did you anticipate that they would perform their stories for you?
Well, the film took about 5 years. That film, Tip of My Tongue, took over the whole period of time. It took about about 2.5 years. And so I spent the first year looking for people who were born between 1958 and 64, and then did 2 or 3 interviews with them, audio only. And I asked all of them to tell me about 5 moments in their lives in which a public event affected some very, very, very personal moment in their lives. And so I actually did not know Cholet Delay at all. Someone just recommended her to me, and I was intent on getting someone from almost every continent in the film. And so her experience was very distinctly different from my own, at least for the first 25 years of her life. And that was really extremely interesting to me. There's a man from Cuba in the film. I grew up in Tennessee, so I thought it was great. There was a man in the movie who grew up on the Lower East Side. That was different from mine experience. A woman from Australia, from Denmark, no, I mean, the Netherlands, a man. So it plays with space and time.
Well, also there's a voice question. I remember there's a moment in that film where you see a woman telling a story, but you're hearing a man's voice telling a different story.
Yeah.
Which is a little troubling to me in the conventional way, but I wanted to ask you about how you decided upon that. moment?
Yeah. Okay. So I had two different people who were talking about they're talking about the period in the early 1980s. So it was they were talking about Ronald Reagan, and they were also talking about the assassination of John Lennon in 1981, and they were also talking about what else? Like I actually can't remember exactly what each of them was talking about, but I switched it because I also wanted to suggest the manipulative aspects of film and the playfulness of it. And so that was this idea that they had actually lived almost the same lives, but yet from completely different places. Like, why don't we do that more in film? We do things in film, let's say, where we dub, or we do things where, Julie Andrews sings for in which
Audrey Hepburn.
Audrey
No,
Hepburn.
not Audrey Hepburn. Is that
Right?
right? No.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
Audrey Hepburn. Julie Andrews wasn't on camera, but she sings and it's perfectly in sync. And it makes it look like Audrey Hepburn had this beautiful voice. But wouldn't it have been more interesting if they'd not just fooled us, but actually showed how that was constructed? And those were the kind of things that I wanted to do. And I wanted to let the form of Tip of My Tongue reveal, like, to talk about shared time, but not for that only to be suggested through content, but through the form. That's what I was trying to do. Thank
And
you for noticing all my different, what do you call, like material manipulations of the cinematic gesture. Experiments, definitely
right.
experiments.
Yes. Well, these are the things that are also really interesting to me as well. So one more example in that film, and I guess we can bring in Stephen as well as relevant, but it's about the sound treatment during the Anita Hill hearing.
Oh, I'll just say one thing. So if you go to C-SPAN, you can get recordings of so many different events in our shared public life. And for example, C-SPAN will send you, or you can record it off the TV off of their like archive, the entire Anita Hill interview, and I mean not interview, hearings. And so
Clarence Thomas hearings at which
yeah, but that's right, they were the Clarence Thomas hearings, and they were Anita Hill's like testimony. So I'm just going to move spaces for 1 second, okay?
All right. While you do that, it just brings up the small point that this year Clarence Thomas will have been on the Supreme Court for 30 years. Isn't that a daunting thought?
Okay, so what happened? I'm sorry, now I'm just sitting on a bed. What happened was that I gave that material, I sent it to Stephen, and I told him it was okay if we played with it in the way that memory is. So you might not remember exactly what Anita Hill said, but you'd remember your emotional reaction and your or visceral, or what you thought. Actually, I should ask some of you what you remember, if you were alive at that time, about the Clarence Thomas hearings. Not, but Stephen, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of my favorite moments, and I don't always fully remember what I should take credit for or not, but I do remember playing with her voice, stripping layers away, stripping clarity away, so that you're moving in and out of an awareness of her words or just the textures. And then there's a certain point where, I think you took away all language, which leaves her powerless, and which is, for me, the way I remember her.
Mhm.
We'll remember
without a
what they did
voice.
to her as opposed to her. I mean,
Yeah, and her without a voice.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's also quite incredible, because when I was started working on Tip of My Tongue, and I was working with Amanda Katz, who was about 27 at the time, she had no idea who Anita Hill was. This would have been in 2016. And I think, as with that movie, I've noticed how history comes back to haunt or remind us. And so Anita Hill's name became part of our conversation, public, internet, national conversation around the Me Too movement. And it and I remember Amanda saying to me, you know what, Lynn, I actually do know who Anita Hills is now, because I've been working on this movie with you. Yeah.
So let me just do a couple questions regarding, we're already almost an hour in. So let me ask a couple more questions regarding Film About a Father Who, and then ask all of you for input. So for Film About a Father Who, first, why was this the time for you to finish the film?
Mm-hmm. I would say that I started to understand better how the film could happen. There were so many reasons not to make that movie. So, I mean, I was scared of it. I was intimidated. I didn't know what my point of view was. I was um, critical, very critical of the material I had shot 30 years ago. I thought it was flawed. And, I was looking at it from 2017 and 18 and 19, and I was judgmental of it. And also the material itself had been degraded by time. It had been left in garage, some of it left, much, the things I had shot were in good condition, but things by other family members weren't necessarily. And then I realized that that there was a kind of physicality to the material, like it had grown old in the way that I had. And then also I was more cognizant of the fact that I would start to talk to other members of my family, and that the film could reflect, in the way that Tip of My Tongue did, different perceptions of the same experience, and of being children of our dad. And so all of these things started, that were obstacles, became methods of trying to understand the film. And also I needed to grow up. I needed to go on to the next phase of my life. Like, if you do this one thing, I did some other things in my life, but if you keep working on one thing for 30 years, you're just telling yourself, I need to get this done. And I knew I wasn't going to not finish it. So those were some of the reasons. And also that I found out about two of my sisters I didn't know about, and I thought I need to integrate them into this process.
How difficult or not was it to find and incorporate all these half siblings?
Yeah, and I kind of resisted calling them not that you should.
Well, yeah, you're right. You didn't
Yeah.
in the film, so it was
Yeah.
inappropriate for me to do that.
No, I don't even mind. I just want to say that if I had done that in the film, it probably would have helped with some clarity. But I actually was never really looking for straight ahead exposition. I wanted to have, like, some of the ambiguities that I had actually had to contend with my whole life anyway. Ambiguity, like, what does that really mean? But I made a point of either flying to see one of my sisters, or another one coming to like the shot of me and my sister Julia lying on a bed together. She flew to New York, and we shot together, and we sat for hours talking. And I think the film became a bit of a vehicle for us to get to know each other better. And then my other sister, Beth, was willing to work with me and allow me to come to her house. And I mean, I know her better now than I even did when I finished the film. Actually, kind of a bit because of the pandemic, now we have a Zoom like this every Sunday. So I know her better, a bit better. I mean, you can't erase not knowing somebody for the first 35 years of their life. You can't say that you can't, it's like saying, when I didn't get enough sleep 3 days ago, so I'm going to catch up. You know, you can't, you don't really catch up. You just sleep that night.
And I mean, it seems like that was an essential point, since your father still is a cipher of some sort after we've watched the film. But the multifaceted, the different perceptions of him are the film, right?
Yeah. And that's, that was that. Actually, I think you're hitting at something. If you only have your perception, then you only have, like, that's why I said it's kind of like a cubist painting. But I also, at a certain point, let's say about 3 or 4 years ago, realized that my understanding maybe wasn't going to become the ultimately most insightful one. And so by bringing in different perceptions, like, you know, we all have our, like, who am I at work, and who am I in my apartment building, or who am I, you know, when I go to the laundromat. You're all those different people. You're not, and I think that the same situation is how a family works, that you are how you're perceived by all these different people, and how you imprint on them, and different balance between joy and pain for everybody.
And so you mentioned the Von Rainer film briefly, and its importance on you, but actually I just want to ask you to expound upon that a bit more. And why was it even like the touchstone for the naming of your own film?
Okay, so I will say the touchstone was the title, but her work has been, which I always loved. Just one second.
Sure.
Hi, Adam.
Hey, Sandy, how are you doing?
So her work has been important to me for a long time. I mean, I saw her film Privilege, I saw her film Lives of Performers, I saw her film Trio A. All of them in different ways have left like some kind of residue in my consciousness. And I think with film about a father who I was very interested in the ways that she and also Lives of Performers, she would get into a person's mind in the way that literature can, like you talk about omniscient, or you talk about the first person and the third person, and she ripped all of that up. But there are also some qualities of that film where she has these very frozen, it's, by the way, if not everybody knows, it's this sort of very important film from 1974 that really rocked everybody's world, like in this, to look at the structure from a feminist perspective of narrative filmmaking, and of narrative in any way, like what it is to be a character, and let's like allow that to explode and be problematic rather than just delivered. But there's some images in that film, for example, of families sitting, they're so awkward, and they're like families sitting at dining room tables, eating in this very, very kind of cold and formalized and directed way. And I wasn't reacting against that, but I was thinking about how we have this emblematic notion of what family is. And even though that film isn't really about family, I remembered that, and I just looked at it again, and I realized what an impact it had on me, and that I actually saw it not even 10 years after, maybe exactly 10 years after it was made. So it wasn't a classic yet. I mean, can it be a classic in just within 10 years? I'm not sure. But now, like, I've actually found, Adam, actually Scott McDonald, who's from a lot of, actually Jenna, you know, he wrote, hi, I know you know Scott. So Scott McDonald wrote me, who he's a a film thinker, historian, critic, especially of avant-garde film. And he wrote me an email the other day and he's like, how many people really know that you're referencing an Yvonne Rainer film called Film About a Woman Who? And I wrote to him and I'm like, you're going to be surprised because I showed this film in Nashville. Somebody asked me about this. Like a lot of people know her movie and I don't even know where they see it because it's very hard to find, but it must be shown in lots of film history classes still to this day. So I was kind of wondering about that.
We were able to do a full retrospective with her in person at several of the films of
Oh, that's
5 years ago or so, because she was teaching here. But one more quick question, which is just like, in what elements of that film were staged as opposed to collected footage? Like I mean, I was thinking just of the opening shot of your sort of cutting his hair, but to me that's such a metaphor for like you're trying to like cut away at some sort of tangled hair, some tangled
Well,
web.
actually, every time my dad came, and hair is a big way of, the length of hair. It's always been a conversation in my family. And when I was a kid, my sister and brother and I would be kind of like embarrassed. Our dad's hair was longer than everybody else's, and definitely not coiffed in any way. And then you get to be a certain age and you go off to college and you're like, my dad's cool, he's really a kind of a bohemian, but and so hair was always a conversation. And as my dad got older, he didn't really take very good care of it, so he would come to visit. I would help. I honestly have to try to get the tangles out. And then I had filmed that in Super 8 about 5 years ago. And then as I was finishing the film, I realized it was like part of our ritual. And I didn't so much think about it being a metaphor like tangled hair, but I just thought it was actually kind of like the washing society. It was this physicality that you could have that wasn't like just modeling like a hug, but it was also, now I see that it's complicated because I'm combing his hair. Am I trying to conform him? I don't know. And then there's a point where he says ouch, which is like, is this movie an ouch? Is this movie a really big ouch? I'm not sure. And so that it it was something that we do, but it's also something that we did for the camera for that. I mean, I wasn't in a long sweater just combing his hair, but it's something I would have done. And he actually came to live with me for 2 weeks while we were making the film. So I had chances to do some of those kind of domestic things, like the picking up of the trash. My father at that point was doing it all the time. He'd come to New York thinking he could clean up New York and he would pick up everything. But it was also interesting to me because um, he would literally touch things that I didn't want to touch and not think anything of it. And that was like a difference between, so it wasn't just that he was cleaning up, it was that he was touching like things that I thought of as dirty. And it was interesting to me to think that he didn't care about that. And so those are all, when there's something in filmmaking where we actually do end up having a setup of thing that we've already observed 100 times. So it is kind of art, it is a performance, but it's also something that we've collected in our consciousness as part of who a person is. The main thing that is quite set up is the first time that all of us were together and we were sitting around in my brother's living room. And so of scenes in the film, I would say that was the one I initially hated the most because it's not shot the way I would shoot it. But I actually had two friends who were professionals and they came, I mean, not super professional, but they came and shot and they didn't shoot the way I would shoot. And I was like, this looks so professional. But anyway, I tried to amateur it up.
Okay, with that, I guess the easiest way to have people ask a question is in the bottom, there's under reactions, there's raise hand. So I guess anybody can raise their hand or just type a question into the chat if you don't feel like speaking it aloud. But I open it up to all of you. So David, I see your hand is up. Please.
Oh, thank you so much for this, Adam. All these great questions. I'm just mesmerized by Lynne's presence because I love Lynne. I love her films. I've been seeing them since like the film anthology days and the Margaret Mead Film Festival. So yeah, and thank you for the shout out, Lynne. I just adored working with you when you came back from Bali in the mid 80s. And
That's right.
and we worked on that piece at DCTV, you know, which was textual with live Balinese dancer that you found, G'day, and your film footage of women working with sand and materials from Bali, and then our like postmodern meta, you know, live performance, and it
In
really,
1984.
right. But I remember you told me that you had your mind blown. I hope this isn't too personal, but it's in the film, because when I was watching the film for the second time tonight before this Q&A, I almost fell down off my little perch of a low sofa sectional, because you said you started talking about this young woman who had children with your dad, and I finally had the image because I was tiptoeing around, no pun intended, because we did this live interactive dance video together. But I remember, I mean, it was palpable how uncomfortable you were at the time. First of all, by her age, I don't know if she was younger than you, but it was so daunting then. I know you spoke of COVID-19 and 20 is daunting now, but I feel I've been daunted by it. And I remember a few years had passed, maybe before you shot that scene in the 90s, the early 90s with them. And I think I teased you, you know, like, because it was such a heavy hearted thing. And you're like, I can't talk about it. I go, how many siblings are there, you know, besides you and Dana and Ira Jr.?
How many are you asking me?
Sibling. No, then. And I remember you just were like, you just had that like Lynne look that I love, you know, like it's like the Mona Lisa look, you know, and I just didn't know whether you're gonna laugh or cry. And so
well, that's why I kept not being able to finish it, because I didn't know if I was ashamed of it. I didn't know how I felt about it. And then I kept shooting it. You know, life takes you in a lot of different directions, and you know, that moment of my finding out that this trip I was on with my dad was not the trip I thought it was. It became a little bit like a parable in which I was trying to understand our dynamics and what lesson, like now decades later, I could try to see what lessons could be learned, like also the story about the Cadillacs, and you know, that looked exactly the same. And you know, it's interesting because you and I go back such a long way, so you can remember all my challenges. And you know, my other movies have been challenging in different kinds of ways. Like every film is full of obstacles, but this one is definitely the one that was most wrought. But then what happened a couple of years ago was that I knew that that it was also a process of going through the material and making a film that was absolutely not therapy. I actually didn't want it to help me in that way, that it had to be its own work.
yes.
In fact, that it was, I had to distance myself, and by working with someone else on the editing, I was able to see that, and the first year we made 12 experimental films from it. And by doing that, I could find distance, because that filmmaking is what I love, and playing with it. But
Of course.
when I was too literal and when there was too much exposition,
Right.
like that you would do with your friends, then it was like therapy, and that's what I didn't
Of
want to do.
course.
Though
Yeah,
I
which
have to
which
say-
I just my question, I was just like doing the prelude or preamble. Sorry, I'm
oh,
so
sorry. Yeah, yeah.
circuitous, but I was so impacted by when you did make that first reveal, which then there's a succession of, you know, many more reveals. And it was not therapeutic. What was so fascinating to me, and what really blew my mind, you know, wasn't just the content, but the form, because I've seen you evolve and circle back and use, you know, film as material and sound, non-diegetically and diegetically, and like what you're talking with, you know, your collaborator with Stephen now in 4 pieces, how deconstructed it is from just music beds or theme music, you know. So what was remarkable, and here's my question, sorry, it's just, I'm just like overwhelmed at the profundity of your work, and specifically this film, a film about a father who, I'm like really choking up. The dialogue that you had with Dana about syntax and grammar, you know, like kind of mapping out the different types of punctuation, that your mom would have commas and pauses and things are clear and knowable. You know what you're doing. And with the dad, it was just facade of like the exclamation or a semicolon, which you never know what's going to come next, like the unknowability. And I just felt that, this is just my gut feeling, that that's sort of your whole life you've been making this film, you know, not just in 12 parts, but with syntax and deconstructing film materials, and not towards a therapeutic, but towards, I don't know what you'd call it, like, it's not epistemological, it's like this ontology, but it's also so based in musicality, you know, and rhythm. And you pointed to that earlier. So my question, sorry, it's like just considering all of that, which is your whole life, you know, and practice, what shifted for you when you finally finished Film About a Father Who, regarding filmmaking specifically, and anything else you might want to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, if wow, I definitely can't say it as well as you did, David, but I do think that the film, um, the making of the film allowed me to examine how we know things. Like you were saying, is it epistemological, like how we know how we look at certain things and how we look at meaning and how we find meaning. It's not just like, I didn't want to make a film that offered meaning. I wanted to make a film that actually asked us to reckon with the process of finding it. And that, you know, like the scene in Bali where that, you know, where my sister and I had this kind of anger and revelation that a trip we were taking was not the same as what it really was. And that's about knowing. That's about daughters coming to awareness. It's not really important what we knew, but it's discovering that your parents are not who you think they are, that never are. You know, they can't be. They're going to let you down. So I think those were different kinds of revelations, and I tried to construct the film to be a series of not just in revelations of information, but revelations of form, so that as you said, like as one scene led to another, it had to have an ellipsis or some kind of breath where you were thinking about how you shifted from one form, some kind of sound image convergence or fracture. So you're right. The fractures had to either mirror or be in contradiction to what we were talking about. And I never wanted them to be like always in cahoots, and let's say.
Jacqueline, do you want to, please?
Lynn, I actually have I have three questions actually. But mine are really short. I really enjoyed your film. I wanted to know, is your father still alive?
He's in this apartment right now
Okay.
because I came down to Florida here to with my sister Dana, who's also in the film, and we're taking care of him right now because he has like sort of shadings of Parkinson's right now. So yes, and he's seen the film.
And is this-
And well,
You know,
we'll
he's
normally ask his response then, and we'll continue with Jacqueline's,
Yeah.
but
yeah. Go on, Jacqueline.
then I was listening, so I haven't seen your other films, but I was listening to the conversation about your other films, and in this film, there's this moment where you're talking to your brother, I think is Adam, and he's standing and he's really stiff and he's outside, and you're giving him and you're telling him, hey, you know, you got to keep moving. How about moving? How about moving? Right?
That's my bad direction. See, I told you I'm a really bad director.
No, but what it did for me is exactly what you described in a couple of other instances where it's the filmmaking itself is revealed, right? And you talked about it in these other films, and I was wondering, is it a conscious choice or an unconscious choice that this seems to happen for you, where there is this, you know, it's like the fourth wall, you know, or that like the screen is pulled back and you're saying, hey, this is film, this is artifice.
It's really both because I've been making films long enough and not just making films, but watching films. So I'm it's kind of sad. I don't know if you're like this, Adam, or other people, you know, like you've been watching them so much that it makes it really hard to watch mainstream movies because all you can think about is how they're made, you know, like, and why do you do it that way? That's such a convention. Why don't you try, you know, that it never surprise, like they never surprise you plenty. And so if they never surprise you, you become very intolerant. I feel like I'm too intolerant of that. But also, I think people like that scene where I direct my brother and it's so awkward. I think plenty of people do that, but they just don't show it. But I wanted to show it not because it's what do you call it, a blooper, like at the end of a movie, like that's what they used to call it, right? But I also wanted to show it because of this interest in the performance, and that's why you know, the idea that he was really, really, really trying to conform to what he thought his big sister wanted him to do. And that's one of the reasons why I started more recently, because that was years and years ago, to record with my sisters and brothers in darkness so that they couldn't look to me for affirmation. And so they had to look in a more interior way.
Okay, and then interesting. Okay, then my last question is: there are periods of time where where you're talking, it's the voiceover, and it sounds poetic. And I wanted to ask you, is it poetry that you are reading? Is it your poetry?
Some of it is, and I should say that when I was writing the voiceover for this film, I went for a few weeks to a residency at Yaddo. It's an artist residency. They used to say colony, but that's out. So residency near Saratoga in the upstate like way upstate New York. And so I thought I would write like in my little moleskin book, but every time I started to write, I scratched out and scratched out and scratched out. And so then I just started to speak it. And so I recorded it again in the darkness over a few weeks. And then I sent it off to somewhere to be transcribed. And then I worked on it because I had to find that place between poetry and it being too literary, and then so it's a combination. It definitely is, because if I just hand wrote it, it became, I thought, awkwardly literary, and then if I just spoke it, I didn't really like the language, so it was somewhere in between. But I do like to write poetry, and a lot of my films have that in it in a sort of veiled way.
Thank you.
Anybody else wish to raise their hand or type in a question or anything else at the moment? I mean, we're coming up on the point where the conversation is longer than any of the films that are in the center show.
That's true. My longest film ever is Tip of My Tongue, which is 83 minutes.
So there you go. In about 4 minutes, we'll be at that. That seems like an appropriate time then to have the end of the conversation. But let's one or two other questions, I guess, regarding. Actually, probably nobody ever really talks about Drift and Bow. So I just want to
Thank you.
tell me
And it
about
seems
how.
appropriate for what's going on in the United States right now, not in
Yes.
LA, but so Drift
was
and
that?
Bow, what?
So yes, tell us about that.
Yeah. So Drift and Bow is a film about a snowstorm in New York. And I actually, sometimes you get warnings about this, that there'll be a big snow. And so I went with my friend Sean Hanley, and I took my Super 8 camera, and the Central Park was exquisite, and it was just like we say, magical to be there with the ducks coming through the water, and it's a different kind of filmmaking from this other somewhat maybe overly cerebral thinking around filmmaking. It was just really a response to the lines in that way that, like you talk about chiaroscuro, or about the beauties of black. It feels like it was shot in black and white, but because it was snow and trees without leaves, it was kind of a black and white day. So and I loved the lines that I started to see, or the graphics I started to see in the park because of that. And so it also, I have to say that I really like making shorter films. I make them all the time. I've made like quite a few just since the pandemic, because I like the not, it's not always spontaneous, but I like that you get an idea and then you just explore it and then it's done. And some of my other films, I work and I work and I work and I work, and they can be overworked. So I never want to grow up and not make short films ever, because that they give me a lot of joy. And I don't think a film is better because it's longer. And I don't even like the word feature, Adam. You probably don't either. Like, why do people say that something over, let's say, 60 minutes is a feature? Like, actually, I could look at certain short films and talk about them for as long as I could talk about a feature, and probably
course,
with
yeah.
those features. So that's just kind of like the agreement we have in the more alternative filmmaking community.
Films are good either if they're under 20 minutes or over 3 hours, but in between is, yeah, hit or miss.
That's a good point.
It's so just briefly, and then we'll wrap it up. But since you just mentioned it, I want to just see if you could touch upon this a bit more, which is like when you go out and you're going to film black and white, you look at the film, you look at the world differently, in like conceiving how it will register, and like the things that of just tone and line are like activating part of your vision that gets trumped by color and stuff at other times. So I want to ask you about the idea of your ability to see different things differently when you're trying to film them.
Well, you just made me think about something, and maybe somebody else could confirm. The early days of video cameras, everything was black. Was that right, David?
Yeah.
Everything was black and white through the viewfinder, right? Correct?
It was through the viewfinder. I mean, earlier was Sony Portapex, which were filming in black and white, but then
They were filming in black and white, but then weren't we also seeing things in the viewfinder? If you looked through the screen, it looked in black. I think it was black.
yeah,
and
like
white.
70s and 80s when things were recording in color, but the viewfinder I think was still black
Yeah,
and
so you
white.
had to think in black and white. And now I think it's interesting when people shoot video or digital as we would call it. But then they finished the film like this, a film that I saw. It's called the 40 year, not the 40, the 40 year the
The new
version.
one, the 40-year
The new
version.
one. It's a
Yeah.
great film. 40-year version. Thank you. Lisa Lehman just said, yeah, I saw that film and it's in black and white. And I was actually wondering, it's shot in digital. So I was wondering if they actually saw it in black and white and always intended it to be in black and white. Because it feels that way. And it's also, the star is a black woman. And I feel like they made a choice to do that. And also to shoot black skin, you have to know a lot about how to register in order to get the detail through with the aperture and the everything. So I do like I just shot this film with my daughter Maya, and I've shot it in 3 different times of her life. So it's called Maya at 24, like she was 24 and 24 frames per second. But it was important to me to shoot it in black and white so that she kind of ages at those different periods of time, and but also sort of stay in black and white. It feels like she sort of stays the same, and that's kind of fascinating. It's fascinating to shoot in black and white, but for a reason that isn't because of the technology, but because that's how you want to see the world. I'm interested in when people in our time in 2021 choose to, like, I would love to have like some kind of symposium with people who choose black and white in our current day, like why they did. It's very, very interesting.
And do you want to tackle that one other part of that question, which was like the notion of like, can you be conscious of the way you alter your perception of the world when you're filming based on sort of the film you're desiring to make?
Oh my God. Well, the thing is that I still am not very satisfied with the way I shoot with digital cameras. So I have had the same 16 millimeter camera since 1987. David, you've seen it. Lizzie's seen it. It's a wind up camera. And you might think, Lynn, that you would be frustrated because the longest shot is 28 seconds. But that camera is an extension of me. And one day I will drop it. I know I will. Or one day someone will steal it. And I'll have to recognize that camera was a part of my life and I have to say goodbye to it. But when I shoot with my Bolex, it is like a friend, and it's so heavy and I don't care. I like that it holds my body. It makes, for example, I never bought a zoom lens. Well, no, take it back. I bought a zoom lens and it was a bad lens. So I never use my zoom lens with that. And so I don't have any of the liberties that a zoom lens gives you to like not move your body. So that camera like basically tells me what to do.
Excellent. So it's any other last questions or thoughts from anybody? But otherwise, it's coming up on midnight for you. Here, somebody asked, have you tried shooting with the digital Bolex?
Oh no, I didn't know about the digital Bolex. Well, I'm going to have to look into that.
All right.
Well, the company makes it. Oh, she even gave me a little note about that. I'm just realizing I can share the chat, right? We can all share it, right?
Yes, everybody can. If you open it, everybody can see what everybody's chatting. If you send your message to everybody.
Okay. Great. I thought I saw one more question. I'm not sure. Oh yeah, Jenna.
Hi, it's so nice to see you again. I noticed that in several of your films, there's this kind of movement sometimes you have when you're looking at the subject, or maybe subject is not a great word, but you're looking at someone and you're moving in a circle around.
Oh yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk about that, like dynamic.
Yeah, that's in a lot of different places in my film. I mean, actually, it's in well, it's not just these films. Like I made 3 films with my daughter Maya. Photograph of. Did you see those also?
I don't know. I feel like I definitely saw it in some, and really
Yeah.
stuck with me. So
I
now I don't even know.
2001 with her. So photograph of wind, same stream twice, and Maya at 24, all is that, and it's all clockwise. Not that it had to be clockwise, but I just wanted it to continue in the same direction with her. Then actually in Tip of My Tongue, um, a woman named Sue Simon. She's talking about the period of time during AIDS, the AIDS crisis, and she was she was an activist and worked in a clinic, and she was talking about all the different ways that that like her life got turned around and her perception of what was happening and the pathology of it all. And so I have her circling around, and then in gosh, you're the first person to ask me this, but I know the shots. And then in Film About a Father Who, actually my father circles around and my mother circles around, and actually two of my sisters circle around. And I just really love it because um, I love the fact that there's motion, but I ask the people to keep staring at my eyes, or I try to, and so there's an intensity. And then what happens is I get a little dizzy. So it throws me off, but they don't, because you only get dizzy when you turn that way. And you don't get dizzy when you're just running. And so they end up having more control than I do. And it's just been something I love doing. Like when all else fails, I always have someone run circles around me. Thank you for noticing that.
It's really beautiful. And I think maybe it goes back to this conversation about creating the performance where then something else happens. And I love that interaction between you looking and them looking back. It's just really lovely.
Also, I think it's what you just said. It's like it's also that they get to perform, which is different from just be. And also, if you're working with someone who's not used to performing, like my mom or my dad or people, um, if you just say run circles, they think it's so goofy that it's enough. Like, are you sure we need to do this? Yes, let's keep doing this. So,
Thank you.
yay, thanks.
And with that, let's just say let's keep doing this. It's been a wonderful, and it's very coming up on midnight now where Lynn is, so I think it's a good time to wrap up.
Everybody come back. I have two questions for you, Adam. One
yes.
thing is, if you feel like talking more, come back on Sunday, because Stephen will be here, Adam will be here, and we're going to have the film critic. It's so funny. I keep not saying this, but New Yorker film critic, but music critic, excuse me, music critic, not film critic, because he is a big admirer of Stephen's work. He didn't even know my films, but he loves Stephen's work. So I'm really glad he'll be here. But I have a question for you, Adam. If someone buys a ticket to any of the films, how long does it last? Like, do they get it for 2 days or 1 day, or?
So if you buy the ticket for film,
somebody wrote 3 days.
Yes, as a case for Film About a Father Who, Cinema Guild is doing it as 72 hours from the time you buy, or the time you log in. For the other one, the 4 that we are buying, the packet of 4, we did not make a time limit. So unless Canyon did. I think Canyon said they could do it for, I don't think they did. Or he said it had to be like a week or like a month. And I said, well, just make it a month. And then we just turn off the page after Monday. And then, so.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't even know that.
So buy the 4-pack, the 4 film, which is a sliding scale. So if you're tight right now, you can do it for 0. And then watch the films, and they'll be available through Monday. So Sunday's Conversation is at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern. And the films will be available on Monday as well until the end of the day.
I wanted to say thank you so much for your extremely hard work, Adam. And also to say I don't know of any other venues in the US. I've seen it plenty in Europe, but that had a sliding scale. So I just want to say thumbs up for that. Really
I was inspired to do that by my partner here, but it's, I think, the right thing to do in this day and age as well. So Well, thank you very much for conversing with us tonight. We've recorded it. It'll be on our YouTube channel at some point in the future. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you very, very much once
Thank
again,
you,
Lynn. And
everybody.
have a great evening.
What a hoot.
Yep. Cheers.